Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, which is number 2 in a 3-part series on communication equity and meaningful access for victims of domestic violence who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind. This second webinar will focus on why communication equity matters. This is a joint webinar sponsored by the Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and DHHS, as well as the Domestic Violence Commission, which is kind of part of the Council for Women and Youth Involvement in the Department of Administration. I just want to share a few housekeeping and communication rules for this webinar. If you would like to watch communication access real-time translation, captioning, please click on the CC button on the bottom of your screen. There is also an external link for CART services to be viewed on another device or browser that has been posted in the chat. I will post it again after these introductory comments. ASL interpreters are being provided during this webinar. If you experience any type of communication access issues, please send a private chat to the co-host to notify us. Please do not use the chat for general questions and comments. Instead, we would prefer that you use the Q&A feature for asking questions or making comments when requested during the webinar. During the question and answer portion of the webinar, if you have a question and would like to use ASL to sign your question, please type into the Zoom chat to the co-host that you would like to do so. The communication moderator will then promote you from an attendee to a panelist. We are recording this webinar for future use, so please try not to use the chat box for general chatter because it blocks the view of the presenter and the PowerPoint. I'm going to now turn this over to our presenters to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. This is Ashley Benton. I'm the Deafblind Services Coordinator with the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I welcome you all back for part 2 of Communication Equity, Why It Matters. I'm happy you are all here. I am deafblind. I'm using tactile ASL interpreters that are off the screen. They are also voicing for me. I have one female and one male voice, so you may hear different voices. And obviously the deeper voice is the male, but just wanted to let you know about that. Now, on to my co-host, Blair.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I'm really excited to be with you all today. My name is Blair Johnston, and I'm the manager for the Charlotte Regional Center for the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm also a member of the Victim Service Council, which is under the North Carolina Council for Domestic Violence. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Tony at this time.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Davis. I'm the Accessibility Resources Coordinator at the Administrative Offices in Raleigh for the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I myself am hard of hearing, light deafened. I use an implant. I also use captioning. So if you have an opportunity today to read captioning on a live transcript on the bottom of the screen, do so. It's really great. That's what I use to get through webinars and meetings like this. I look forward to our day together.
Next slide, please. Back up just one. I would like to bring up a poll just to test your knowledge before we get started. Okay, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, 2 minutes or so to read over this poll and answer the questions to the best of your ability, and then we will discuss it together. Okay, I think we are done. I can't really see the results just yet, though. All right, next slide, please. All right. So 48 million deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind people within the U.S. and 1.2 million in the state of North Carolina alone. Was that question true or false? 96% of you said it was true, and you all are smart. That is correct. Often we are, it's easy to overlook our hearing loss. And so people just may not be aware that they have a hearing loss as well. Now, question number 2, when scheduling an appointment, it's common for deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind individuals to think the scheduler has no experience working with people with hearing loss, so accessibility has not been considered. 87% of you answered true, and it is correct. It's very common for us to think they probably are just not aware, they haven't thought about access and how to provide it, so we do think of that pretty often. All right. So next question, question number 3. What does nothing about us without us mean when it comes to working with deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind populations? 70% of you answered both 2 and 3. So it means our communication needs are not solved by a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to ask us about our individual communication needs and preferences and how we can access whatever it may be that we're trying to access, a meeting or appointment or whatnot. And then no policy should be decided by any representative without the full and direct participation of members of the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities. We need to be involved and to know what's going on. If a policy is written about us but without us, that's not an appropriate accommodation. We need to be involved in those conversations. Okay, next slide. The goal for today's webinar is that we hope you'll learn several things, learn about communication equity and what that means and what it looks like, and to learn, what it means when we say nothing about us without us. Allyship, how you can support and become an ally for the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities. It is the first step, which you've already accomplished by joining our webinar today and learning how to do that. So good job on completing the first step. We also want you to learn about deaf culture and what that looks like, what we value within your services, We also want to talk about accommodation and how a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. Everyone has different needs, so accommodations will look differently. And we also want to talk about what it looks like to work with our community. So those are the things we hope you learned from today's webinar. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Tony at this time.
Next slide, thank you. So this next slide, if you look at the picture, it's an iceberg. So those with hearing loss are like icebergs. It's often difficult to see what's underneath, what's below the person, what's going on within a person. It's a hidden disability. Hearing loss is a hidden disability, and it's often overlooked, especially when we're working with hard of hearing people, and often misunderstood. And I say overlooked because hard of hearing, many of them don't even like to share that they have hearing loss. Well, when it comes to hearing loss and working with people with hearing loss, the goal is effective communication. That means we're able to communicate with the person with hearing loss, and that the person with hearing loss is able to communicate back effectively. Now, it's a very simple goal, but achieving it is very complicated. Next slide, please. So again, people with hearing loss, you can see what's on the surface, but you can't see what's going on with them deep down under the surface, what's going on with them emotionally, within their lives, with communication. The impacts of hearing loss are great if no communication access happens. It's important to understand that deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind are not the same. So people who are deaf and people who are hard of hearing and deafblind don't function the same. And oftentimes they don't use the same type of communication accommodations or communication access. Communication impacts us all differently. And I'll talk a little bit about that. For instance, socialization. Well, a person who's deaf and uses ASL, well, if they're around other people who use ASL, they're going to be able to communicate really well in a group of people. Now, in a domestic violence situation, you might see the person in the relationship who's the abuser might keep the person that's being abused away from other people that they can effectively communicate with. A hard of hearing person may have a very different experience with socialization. Oftentimes, a hard of hearing person loses their hearing gradually, or maybe all of a sudden after they've already developed speech later in life. And so at one point, they were able to socialize with other people. But now they go into a situation where other people are around them. They may not be able to hear what's going on. They might say things that seem off topic. That might be embarrassing. And oftentimes, what happens, a result of this, is that people start to isolate themselves because they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to be misunderstood. They don't want to look like they can't understand. So this is hard of hearing again. And when they start to isolate themselves and not participate, and this includes in activities like at a domestic violence shelter and so forth, then they're going to start to experience depression because they're isolated. There's also health implications on people with hearing loss. I'll explain that. People with untreated hearing loss that don't wear hearing aids are, 50% more likely to experience dementia in their life or to have dementia. And they're 200 to 400% more likely to fall. People with diabetes are 50% more likely to have hearing loss. So there's a lot of different health implications. I could talk on the slide for a full hour, but we'll just cover a few things here. Financially, people with hearing loss are less likely to be able to get employed. Some do, that's for sure. There are very successful people with hearing loss, but it's more difficult to obtain employment and to keep employment. Relationships, that's something else I often talk about, related to the impacts of hearing loss. So, for instance, a hard of hearing person, when they lose their hearing and they can no longer talk on the phone sometimes, they depend on other people to make calls for them. They depend on other people to help them to be able to communicate. And you could see how that would be a negative in a situation of domestic violence, where a person is depending on somebody else to communicate for them or on their behalf. They can be totally taken advantage of in that situation. That can also happen with people who use ASL. For instance, the police can show up at somebody's door and there's no interpreter with that police officer, and the police don't want to wait. So they use the spouse or the partner who's been, the abuser in this situation to help interpret the situation. There's many other great impacts that we don't see on people with hearing loss. Those were just a few. Again, we could go on and talk about these things for a full hour or even two. And maybe eventually we'll have the opportunity to do that. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn the time over to Blair.
All right. For those who are deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind, they have specific experiences. I shared before that the one-size-fits-all approach is not effective for these communities, but I do also want to share an experience that when we face a situation, when we ask for accommodations, we do actually have a very common shared experience. We have experienced people making assumptions on our behalf when we make a request. Commonly, there are a few things that will happen. Here are some comments from specific individuals. The scheduler has no experience working with people with hearing loss. Therefore, accessibility has not been considered. They don't know how to work with people with hearing loss. They don't consider my access for that appointment or that meeting. Often, the scheduler will assume it is my responsibility to provide my own accommodations. I have to wait and show up just to see if the accommodation will be provided. It might be, it might not be, or it might be that they provide an inaccurate or wrong accommodation. And that's hard, constantly waiting, not knowing. You might have confirmation in a phone call that it's there, but you might not know exactly what it is until you actually get to the location, and maybe it's not what you actually need. It's not appropriate. If a last-minute appointment, such as emergency intake, comes up, I might not have the ability to have effective communication. It takes so much advanced planning before an appointment to call and make sure that accommodations will be provided. And if something happens last minute, we're often out of luck. In domestic violence situations, things need to happen last minute, and maybe an abusee makes a last minute decision to flee, and then there's no communication access. Another comment I have had to explain and cite federal accessibility laws to convince a scheduler that they are obligated to provide an accommodation. And even when I have explained that, I still have to take on the responsibility of telling them how to actually provide that accommodation. These are all very common experiences for us, and they take a toll. I have friends and family, and I have heard stories from the community many times over. We talked about Myra Torrance and her story in our previous webinar, and we actually watched her story and her testimony about her personal survival story of domestic violence, what she went through and what she experienced. That webinar is available online, and if you have the opportunity, I highly recommend that you watch that so that you can see her story firsthand. It is very powerful. Myra realized that she needed to leave an abusive relationship, and she called 3 different domestic violence service providers. All 3 of them did not provide any services to her. One kept repeatedly hanging up on her because they didn't understand the relay service that she was using to call. A second one she worked with but was unable to receive services from. And the third, she thought if she would be able to get through to speak to someone, the team at that third location didn't want to speak through the interpreter to be able to hear her story. The results of all of this meant that she stayed in her abusive relationship longer than she needed to, or she could have. They didn't bother going through the legal system or the mental health system. That means that her story shows on several accounts how hypervigilant she had to be, as is common in that community. The stress and anxiety that she held trying to contact the legal system and navigate through mental health systems to see if she could even receive help or service. It also shows how exhausting the efforts of self-advocacy can be and all that she had to do to even try to have access to a system of care. This leads to advocacy exhaustion. Going back and forth with a service provider, Myra actually got so hung up trying to even navigate communication with them that she didn't feel like it was worth continuing. It was very exhausting for her. The fact that she didn't bother contacting the police or mental health services is also attributes to that level of exhaustion. Myra had no trust in the system. She was not able to effectively contact law enforcement, and she knew that since her partner was hearing, that he would be able to manipulate the court system and manipulate law enforcement, and that they would believe her partner more than they would believe her in that scenario. At the end of her story, she speaks about what she realized. First of all, that she needed to trust herself, even though she had such a strong distrust in the system. And that is truly a powerful testimony. Again, I recommend you watch it if you have the opportunity. It's important to emphasize here that she stayed in that abusive relationship longer because she didn't have access to resources to get out. Next slide. Okay, back to Tony.
Next, I'm going to talk about accommodations. I'm going to talk about communication access for different populations with hearing loss. It's important to understand that with hearing loss, accommodations, not one size fits all. You've heard that several times. We'll continue to say that. That means deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind populations, the people in those populations do not all use the same types of accommodations. They use different types of accommodations. I'll talk a little bit about that. So first of all, deaf individuals primarily use American Sign Language to communicate. Some may use a certified deaf interpreter to communicate in situations like a domestic violence shelter or an intake interview or so forth. We can talk more about that with you as you need that service. If somebody said they need a deaf interpreter, please reach out to us. Hard of hearing typically do not understand American Sign Language. Some do, I do, but I'm unique in that. Most hard of hearing people do not. Most will prefer captioning, communication access real-time translation, like the captioning we're using today. Many will use hearing aids, cochlear implants, or other assistive listening devices. Many will use other types of technology if they're aware of that technology, what to use. Deafblind can be any degree of hearing loss, any degree of visual loss. So you can have somebody who's deafblind that uses ASL. They might use tactile interpreters, and they might use other types of sign language. Many or some may use hearing aids or cochlear implants, again, any degree of hearing loss. So they might function as a hard of hearing person. Some deafblind will use a support service provider. So it's important to understand, though, also, that you might have a hard of hearing person who uses ASL, or you might have a deafblind person who uses technology. You might have a deaf person who uses captioning. The most important thing we can do is provide the accommodation that they request, not assume that we know how to provide the right type of accommodation without asking them. Next slide, please. So the communication equity experience. When we get the needed communication accommodations, and when people have accommodating attitudes and they want to work with us, then we experience communication equity. If a deaf person gets an ASL interpreter when they need it, and that's what they've asked for. If a hard of hearing person gets CURT captioning when they need it, and that's what they've asked for. If a deaf-blind patient gets SSP or they get tactile interpretation when they ask for it, they experience communication equity. And when we experience communication equity, we feel fully engaged and included. And we also know that you care. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. When we feel fully engaged and included, we feel a sense of belonging. And when we have a sense of belonging, we trust you. We trust the providers. And that we know we're a teammate with you. We know that you're on our team and we're on your team. And that sense of belonging also brings us peace, especially during times of distress. And that's really important that we feel that. And you want all of your consumers to feel that. Thank you. Next slide. This time I'm going to turn it over to Ashley.
Hello, this is Ashley. Maybe by now, you're starting to understand communication equity. The deaf individuals need a sign language interpreter. I want to provide that. So now give me the interpreting list so you can get going on that. It's going to be a little more complicated than that. Let's first talk about what an interpreter does. An ASL interpreter is responsible to facilitate the message between two languages, English into ASL, which is American Sign Language. American Sign Language is its own language. It has structure, grammar of its own, but it's a visual language. So it takes a specialist to interpret between the two languages. So the interpreter must be proficient in both of those languages to complete that process from English to ASL. Also, you need to understand that the interpreter must make the communication meaningful for both participants so that that full understanding happens. So the interpreter has to be knowledgeable of terminology, vocabulary that's pertinent to a certain situation, and be of a certain educational level. We have a minimum of a 2-year degree for a person interpreting and should have a 4-year degree or more to be able to function in that type of professional settings. We do have interpreters who specialize in legal settings. We have some that specialize in mental health settings, and we do have some that specialize in domestic violence settings. Because in each of these settings, you're going to have vocabulary that are specific and mean certain things in those settings. So if you're in the setting of domestic violence, then you want to find an interpreter who has some knowledge and experience in that area. ASL is not a simple language to interpret into. There is a range of styles within ASL, and every deaf person has a different language experience depending on where they learn sign language, when they learned it. Did they learn it early in life or later in life? Is there a mix between assigned English and American Sign Language? There could be some sort of developmental delay impacting the complexity of their language use, and any other type of factors. Maybe an individual has CP, cerebral palsy, and that can impact how the sign language physically looks coming off the body. So you would have to find an interpreter who is even more specialized. Sometimes we use a deaf interpreter. So we'll bring a deaf individual in to work with the hearing interpreter because they are a native user of the language. And so they're able to help facilitate between the hearing interpreter, who is proficient in English and ASL, but they're not a native signer. So we'll bring a deaf interpreter in to also have another set of eyes to make sure the communication is fully effective. So there are more than just going down a list of names of things to consider when selecting an interpreter. Deaf-blind interpreting. Same here with the complexity. Not all interpreters are qualified to interpret for individuals who are deaf-blind. Could depend on how much vision they still have, how much hearing they still have. And they have to adjust in any given situation. So the interpreter has to be ready to be able to be flexible. Maybe they have to have a smaller signing space. Maybe the distance between themselves and the deaf-blind individual will be different. Need to think about features like lighting, have contrasting backgrounds like we're showing here. So I have front lighting, I have a black background, and I have a shirt on that contrasts with my skin. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. A lot of deaf-blind individuals are transitioning in their language journey as well. So I grew up, I was sighted. I could see, and I could see all the other people, and I was signing back and forth, and I didn't need any adjustments. I could typically communicate with other individuals who signed. But as my vision worsened, I had to start adjusting to closer vision, and then all the way now into using tactile ASL. So that's a transition for me. So my interpreters have to understand that I was transitioning as well, and they have to be flexible and adjust and modify their signing from visual to tactile. It's not just the same signs in the air, putting those in the hand. There's a certain method or a style that you use when signing with tactile ASL to modify the signs so that they are clear. Maybe a deaf-blind person is skilled and can use only one hand. I've been using it for 10 years, so I use only one hand to receive my tactile sign language. Other people who are starting, they may have to use two hands and go more slowly and struggle through the process until they become proficient. So that's a challenge. So that's another thing to consider with this population. Next slide, please. Tony, over to you.
So communication access real-time translation is a real-time word-for-word transcription of the spoken language. And many people with hearing loss really benefit from this and really depend on it. And it is appropriate for any meeting where a person really needs to understand what is said during that meeting. Again, this is an accommodation that needs to be requested from a person who's hard of hearing or deaf or deafblind that prefers this. If a person uses ASL, CART might not be helpful. And vice versa. If a person doesn't use ASL interpretation is not going to be helpful. So CART's great. The best thing I could suggest is to go on the bottom of the screen today, click on the CC button, live transcript, and say, show subtitle. And then you're going to start to understand what CART is. That's CART in action. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is one of the most important slides here, I believe. It's how can one foster inclusion in a way one plans an appointment, a meeting, or an event. And the first suggestion is we say, make a change. Dedicate yourself to making that change, because most agencies, most that provide services, most businesses don't think about communication access, and it's really important that we do. We change our mindset. So add communication access into your procedures, build it in. Now, we are there to help you to do that. So if you want us to work with you on your procedures, contact us. That's what we do. Even, and also build in that even a last minute meeting requires accommodations. Just because it's difficult to get accommodations doesn't mean we don't provide them. It's going to be hard work, I promise you. But the result is the person who's deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind is going to get the communication that they need. They're going to understand what you tell them, and you're going to understand them. Ultimately, they're going to be helped, and it's going to be very impactful for you as well. Have a list of ASL interpreters and CART agencies that provide these services. And really important, train your staff on how to utilize those lists. A list does nothing if you don't know how to use it. Again, we can help you to understand how to do that. Understand your obligation under accessibility laws to provide accommodations. It's effective communication. It's ADA. It's 504. There's many civil rights laws that say we need to provide effective communications to those we serve. We can help you to understand that better if you need to understand that. Important to budget for communication access. I've worked with many agencies, divisions, businesses, etc., to help them understand the importance of building in a communication access budget. I remember working with this one large agency, and they began to attend webinars just like this. And they said, I see why we need to build this into the budget. And they began to do that. So for the last year, they've been providing communication access real-time translation, and as requested, ASL interpreters for their meetings, for their webinars, for their events. And they're thrilled that they're doing so. They understand the impact that it's making. It's important to advertise well in advance that you're willing to provide communication access, that you are providing communication access for certain events, that you plan to do so. Put it on your flyers, put it on your announcements, even put it on a sign in the lobby that you have that says, we provide communication access. It's important. Thank you. Next slide, please.
This is Ashley. There are many dynamics to consider when talking about communication equity. People sometimes question if deaf people have their own culture. And that is true, we do. The center of our culture is that we have our own language, and it is cherished. It's a visual language, and it's how we interact. We are very visual people in general. Deaf-blind individuals, a subset of that, have our own culture. So it is a subculture of the larger deaf culture. And there would be that in other cultures as well. Mexican deaf individuals, also Mexican deaf-blind individuals, for example. And so how we share information is really important to us because we have had to share resources with each other and support each other. So if one deaf person goes into one business or somewhere and they have issues or have frustrations getting access, then they'll tell the rest of the community about that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We have rules of behavior as well. For example, applause is a good example of this. Hearing people can hear hands clapping together. We cannot hear that, so we modify that and do shaking hands in the air. Technology is another thing that we cherish. We have flashing lights to let us know our phone's ringing. We have an alarm that can vibrate on our bed. So there's that shared experience that people have. We have art, history, all of these features of a culture. So in fact, we do have something known as deaf culture. Next slide. Okay. Here's some more important dynamics to consider. So in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space that we're in these days, we hear that word privilege a lot, and recognizing privilege and see where it comes in and can interfere with the process of making sure that people have equal access and inclusion. So once you recognize that privilege, you can be able to assist in not letting it affect the situation. So first thing to consider is incidental learning. And what I mean by that is hearing people all their lives have been able to just pick up on things that are naturally in the environment, that are presented in the auditory, like TV, radio, people talking beside you, just sitting beside other people and picking up information that way. Doesn't seem like it's important information, but you're taking that all in the background. And so when a topic comes up in another setting, say, oh yeah, I did hear something about that, for example. And that starts at a very young age. So think about a deaf child as compared with a hearing child. A deaf child grows up in a home where 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, meaning that communication is not present in the home because a low percentage of parents who have deaf children actually learn sign language and communicate with their children. So they're growing up without any auditory input, but they're taking things in visually. So they don't have the opportunity to learn how to communicate, deal with conflict. They see the parents talking, they're moving their mouths, so they're not able to learn incidentally how they solved a conflict or they solved another problem they were having or how they communicated with each other. So none of those things were picked up naturally. A hearing person grows up and takes advantage of all of the input that they receive through hearing. So that's a gap in development for deaf children. It's something we call a fund of information. So our fund of information is seriously delayed as compared to a hearing person's fund of information. So that is a form of privilege. Hearing people have the ability to walk into any building or any place and receive the services and don't have to consider ahead of time, I wonder if I go to that church if they'll have communication access. I wonder if I go to that business, will they have communication access? So the choices are open for people who hear. Because you will have communication. You say, well, they speak English, I speak English, so you feel comfortable going into any situation. As a deaf person, our options are limited. There's not many churches that have access for deaf people. There's not many agencies that have deaf staff. Meetings that are open to the public, which actually have an interpreter, are few. So the options are limited as compared with the hearing population. So hearing privilege also exists when you don't have to worry about planning ahead of time because you just assume that and have confidence that the place will have what I need. And so we don't think about planning. Here at DSDHH, if we have set up a meeting, we have to give 2 weeks prior knowledge or to find the interpreters that we need. Interpreters don't grow on trees. There's a shortage in the community. So we can't call and say, hey, I need an interpreter tomorrow. So that it takes that pre-planning for almost every meeting we do or any event we do. So deaf individuals who are trying to take advantage of community resources, it's very difficult. I used to be a substance abuse counselor, and I would try to get my clients to go to AA or NA meeting. And so their philosophy at NAAA, if you have a craving, then you go immediately to an NAAA meeting. Well, that's not something that a deaf person could do. They wouldn't be able to access it that way. They can't just show up off the street to be involved. So I would say, you better sit in a meeting than a bar. So just go sit there, even if you can't communicate and get the information. So they would do that. However, when you go sit in there and you can't understand what everybody's saying, that only increases your anxiety. So planning is such a huge part, and it can be exhausting. Choices in seating. We can't sit anywhere. Maybe you in the audience are thinking, what are you talking about? Seating? What does that matter? again, that's not something that you have to be concerned about. You never really thought about, okay, where am I going to sit when I get there? Is there a specific place in the room I need to be there? Because that doesn't show up as a concern for you. But as a deaf-blind person, I have to consider where I'm sitting at all times. We have to be able to see the communication access, where I can still see the captioning, where I can, do I have room to set up for tactile interpreting? I can't show up to meetings late. If I get to a meeting late and the room is full, then I'm stuck. I can't do it. So, and I just have to get by how I can. I have to arrive every place early to make sure I can reserve spacing that I need for my access. Here at DSCHH, we have 75% of our staff who have hearing loss or deaf and use sign language, so we're used to that. So our staff will be courteous and wait till other people have entered the room, get the seating set up, and then they'll take up whatever's left. So that's a cultural consideration we have here at our agency. So just realize that deaf, hard of hearing, deaf-blind individuals need to have that choice. So be respectful of that and move if necessary. So that's something to consider when you have an event. Have reserved seating for any individuals with hearing loss so that they don't have that added concern of where am I going to sit when I get there. The last two, which I'm going to rush through. So another part of hearing privilege. So you can multitask simply. So you can listen to something going on in the background while writing and doing other things. We have to stay engaged with eye contact, stay engaged with our captioning, stay engaged with our interpreter, stay engaged with our tactile sign language. So we have to focus on one thing at a time. So for example, a Zoom meeting, we all have our cameras open at all times because we have to maintain that eye contact to know what's going on. Because we're all in the same boat, right? So, but if there's one or two hearing people in the meeting, they typically will have their video off and we're like, well, they're probably multitasking. They're probably reading something on the computer and writing something down. So we feel like, well, that's unfair, right? They should be engaged as well, like the rest of us, since we don't have the ability to do that. When you pass out an agenda or pass out a PowerPoint, a deaf individual has to break that eye contact with the interpreter to look at the agenda and look at the PowerPoint. So when presenting information on paper or on screen, give a pause for the people to take that information in. So what can you do? I know you would like to be an ally. I want to be able to do something. This is just the beginning. We will go into detail next week in webinar 3 on how to apply some of this information. What you can do to become an ally. Number one, the crucial part is patience. Be considerate of time in your meetings and appointments. Let people have time to read things on text and then look back at the communication access. When you're turn taking in meetings, take appropriate turns. Don't talk over each other. Identify yourself, because if we're engaged with our interpreter, then we can't see who's talking. So if you identify the name, then we know, okay, this person's talking now, this person's talking now. Especially for me as deaf-blind, it helps when people clearly identify themselves. Like I mentioned, wait your turn. If there's a mic involved or any kind of assistive listening technology, you have to wait till that is passed around. And the interpreters can't keep up when people talk over each other. And when you are corrected or you're reminded of that, try not to do the eye rolls like, okay, well, we got to slow down for the deaf-blind person, or, oh yeah, everybody wait for the deaf person over there. Don't do that on a one-off. Set up communication rules at the beginning of the meeting that everyone has to adhere to. That way it helps everyone. And when you do make communication rules explicit, it helps everyone know that they're actually benefiting from it as well. So people need time to think, process, and go through the meeting clearly, because everyone has different styles. Be empathetic. That's a big one. We heard about Myra and her frustrations earlier. and she had advocacy fatigue. And so she just gave up. I mean, part of her story is she hung up on one of the providers. And can you imagine if you were that? And then you're upset, like stupid deaf people, they don't, but just try to think of where that frustration came from and how it, was it in the moment that she hung up, or was it from her past experience and frustration? So have respect for your consumers. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been to a conference with a full room of hearing people. I come in with my interpreters, and it's maybe we're sitting at lunch or something's going on, and I see hearing people are talking around, and they're talking with complete strangers that they just met. And here I'm sitting over here, and who am I talking to? My interpreters. And so I feel like you say, oh, they're all right over there. They've got an interpreter with them. They've got that. And they won't walk up and just strike up a conversation or meet someone. So it's a learning experience, and I'm missing out on learning from all the other information that they're having, just incidentally meeting each other. So just think about it. You know, 2,500 hearing people in the conference, and then I'm the one deaf person that walks in, right? So it's awkward for me to just start to walk up and talking to people because I can't tell if you're talking with someone else. I don't know if I want to interrupt. So that's difficult, that dynamic. So I welcome you to be inclusive yourself, and you make the initial step to go communicate with a person in this population. Get to know your consumers, develop a rapport with them, because that rapport can go a very long way. If a situation comes up that you don't have an interpreter or something happened that the communication messes up, if you have a good rapport with the individual, it'll go a long way toward getting a successful outcome. And finally, the respect for the consumers is important. They can be independent if they have the communication access they need. You know, don't assume that they need to go find, oh, that person speaks the same language that can talk with them. It's easy to get information from other people. Or they end up going back to the abuser, and that's where the communication comes from. You can set up appropriate communication access and have that one-on-one conversation with them yourself. And one thing I forgot is you want to make sure to be proactive. These things we're teaching you work, but they only work if you plan appropriately ahead of time. Have your resource list ready. Have your options ready to go ahead of time, because you don't become an expert overnight. It'll take you time to learn to use your resources, form partnerships with other agencies, and figure out how to provide the best service to make you prepared. And if you're unsure what to do, just ask the individual. Sometimes the consumer may be more flexible in some situations. Maybe it's an emergency, and they understand that you can't get an interpreter at the last minute. They'll say, hey, we can write or text on my phone until the interpreter gets here. Or so the individual will be flexible too. But again, you have to develop that relationship and figure out what you can use for now to get through. So it's having that working relationship with them. All right, next slide.
Hello, everyone. So I do want to share just a little bit about the Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Myself, Ashley, and Tony all work for this agency, and so we are all very passionate about this topic. I know we all have a lot of thoughts about this. If you ever have any questions or want to reach out to us, please do. We serve all 100 counties in North Carolina, and we're happy to talk with anyone who needs support from our services. Our number one goal is to make sure that our community members have access to communication. We are happy to provide consultation if you are making a policy and want someone to take a look at it. If you have a specific case or a consumer come to your agency and you need any help or resources, we are here and we are eager to help you and to speak with you. If you're wondering what best practices might be or how to plan for the future, again, please contact us. We can have a conversation about those things as well. Next slide. I know that we are quickly running out of time, but I did just want to throw out a few questions for you to consider as we leave today's session. We have learned a lot over the course of the first and second webinar. I would ask you to reflect on what you have learned in those 2 sessions and then consider what you might do with that information. I know that it can be a challenging question, so I encourage you to start thinking about it. Do you notice any gaps in the systems where you work? Where are they? What can you do about them? If you went to webinar 1 and you saw what it is like for a survivor with hearing loss, think about what the biggest barriers were that they might encounter when working with you. If you could change something right now, what would you change? So think about these questions and reflect on them next time that you interact with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing or deafblind. You'll be more prepared to know what to do or to reach out to us here at DSDHH. I'd now like to open it up. If you have any questions, anyone from the audience, I believe actually we have one more slide. There we are. If anyone has any questions, you are welcome to use the Q&A or the chat feature at this point. We welcome any and all questions. We would love to hear from you. So this presentation will be sent out to all of you. We are also recording today's session, and it will be available on the website for the Department of Administration under the Council of Women. So I will be sending out that link, but it will be available for all of you to reference there. Got a comment? Great presentation, wonderful information. Thank you so much for that. If you have any other questions, now is your time. We would love to hear from you. We'll go ahead and take a moment to go back to the slide with our contact information on it. Thank you. Oh, I see a couple of things have come through the chat. Thank you, very informative. Thank you so much for sharing those comments. If you do have any questions and you don't want to ask in front of a large audience, feel free to reach out to us privately. We do have our contact information listed on this slide. We are available to you anytime for any question or concern that you may have. Again, we are available for you. And we thank you so much for your time today.
This is Ashley. I see a question. Someone asked if they could purchase CART. So CART is actually provided by a live person, and they do it remotely. So they're doing it today by listening in on our conversation and typing in real time. And we do pay for that service. And we will be talking about that more in detail at the next webinar next week, how to hire an interpreter, how to hire CART. So please, if you could come back for webinar number 3, it's more practical information and where you can find the resources. It's impossible to cover that all in one webinar.